Building a Connected Society, What Works for Refugees. Welcome to the second recording of this conference. In this recording, we will see the Policy and Research panel. This panel will be moderated by Alison Phipps, who, amongst other things, is the chair of the New Scots Integration Partnership. Again, we have three panel participants. First, we have Fotoohi, who's the Director of Refugees for Justice. We have Dinnie, Ajdukovic, a professor from the University of Zagreb, and Alistair Denny from the Edinburgh City Council. This panel will then be followed by a roundtable discussion moderated by Dr. Emelina Kakela. This is where we invite the conference attendees to ask the panellists and the presenters any questions or reflect on any of the content of the panel discussions. We hope you enjoy.
That's lovely. Thanks so much, Bryony. And it's so lovely to see so many people and familiar faces online. Please do forgive me. I had no voice at all at 6 a.m. and my voice is a little croaky, but I think it's going to hold out. And I wouldn't have missed this for the world. It was just really lovely to be invited to moderate this panel. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have such an interesting group of people with different views and different areas of policy and research to speak to us. So I'm going to launch straight in and invite Diane. Diane, if you would share a presentation with us for around 10 minutes. And the question that we've asked you to consider is this. You have a distinguished track record of research into the mental health and well-being of refugees settling into new countries. What for you are the key policy implications emerging through your research? And I have a little timer on my phone, so if you hear it, then I'll be coming in just to wrap things up after 10 minutes. So thanks very much, and over to you, Diane.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'll start first by a few sentences before I go to this slide projection here, which is more about our current research. Now, your question was about the mental health and well-being of refugees settling in new countries, and indeed, I've been looking at that for a number of years. And of course, there are many policy implications. I don't think they're very original. That I can bring any very original implications on that. But a few messages that came out from our research and experience. First of all, I think it is very important that we consider and are aware that the asylum seekers and the refugee population is not homogeneous, that there are people who have, and groups and families, of course, who have had very different history of refugee route, also refugee experiences and experiences in their original countries. And that is something that we need to take into account at the policy level as well, because their needs are different. The second message that I always share with my students is that people are impressively resilient. And the people who have suffered so much and have left their homes and have traveled to the destination countries under difficult circumstances and have been exposed to violence on the route and so on, that the fact that they have survived and that they function as family members or community members is impressive proof of their resilience. Now, of course, there are some people who need more support, who need professional support as well. And this is where we come to the next thing that I want to point out, and that is culturally appropriate professional support. I remember from some of our research with the Bosnian refugees years ago in some of the European countries, including UK, that they were very puzzled, disappointed, and sometimes angry, because the therapists to which they were referred to because of their trauma experiences used a very passive psychodynamic approach. And they criticized their therapists that they were not helpful because they sat there and wanted them to share and talk without feedback that they really needed as a guidance in what is happening, because they have no previous experience with mental health practitioners at all. So that what we offer needs to be culturally adapted and appropriate from the point of those who have access to that. Then another thing that really did strike me is how important it is from the mental health perspective for the people to maintain their role, their social role, their professional role, and their family role. Now, the professional roles are deeply changed because they cannot continue with their profession, earning money and keeping breadwinning for the family, because their qualifications are not recognized, because they don't have the social capital to use it to access the labor market, and so forth and so forth. But within family, the maintaining the roles that traditionally were important and that these are the things that they know, is something that is really very connected to the mental health. But that is a sensitive issue, of course, because there are traditional gender role division, which cannot function in another country that may have or has different rules about that. And that is something that we should look more into and relate that to the mental health. And finally, what I would like to say is that sometimes we are not aware how important for the mental health recovery it is to provide opportunity for the resettled refugees to become active in whatever way they find important. In community work, community connections, of course, professional work, and then within the family. In one of our research where we looked at what helps recovery from PTSD, we found that it was when the traumatized individuals in the family were able to regain the role that they traditionally had, like caring for the grandchildren and being trusted by the family to care for the grandchildren, to take them to school and so forth. So this is the first part. And then the second part of my talk today in this panel is about the research. And this is what you have here. So Fiona, can I have this next one? The next slide. These are the highlights from our from European-wide project called Focus, which is based on the approach to integration as a process, which is dynamic, two-way, and this is very, very close to the reciprocity that was mentioned. It's multidimensional, and it is challenging for both for the receiving and deriving communities. And we know that since 2015, it has been very challenging for the receiving communities because of massive influx of refugees from the Middle East and Syria in particular. And what we have looked at is the key research question here, like how are different modalities of socioeconomic and socio-psychological dimensions of integration, how are they related? And this is what we attempted to study in this project. So what we did is that we studied the same concepts relevant for the integration in both the receiving and the arriving groups by asking the same or comparable questions. about feeling, for example, feeling discriminating and perception of how the arriving community members are discriminated, access to the job market, and the perception of the receiving community about that. So this is something that we think is innovative. And we collected data in 4 countries, and this was qualitative and quantitative and secondary data. So we did also analysis at each of the 4 countries and cross country, and triangulated that. So can I have the next one? All right. So the study countries were Sweden and Germany, who have a history of immigration, and it's a very desired destination country. And they're proud of the multiculturalism traditionally, but that is something that is not always seen like that by both the receiving and arriving community. Then the next country was Croatia, my own, which is a non-destination country. It's not a desired country where people on the move would like to end. So it's transit, it is much lower in economic attractiveness. And the 4th one was Jordan, which is the first country on the Syrian migration route, and heavily burdened with about 1 million refugees from Syria. And so we had a sampling of about 600 in each country. And next, please. Next slide, please, Bernie. Now, I'll try to rush through our findings, heavily relying on the Ager and Strang model. So among the markers and means, what we understood as, let us look at the indicators which may indicate, show better or worse integration. So what we found, and that's not surprising, that the arriving community have lower employment level than the receiving community. But what enables us is to compare the countries where this gap is smaller or bigger, and that is something that they can take into account. Now, the arriving community hold jobs which are way below their level of education or the previous jobs. They have specific issues with housing because their families are typically larger, unless it is isolated men. They have difficulties in accessing tertiary education because of language and the expenses. And that is something that could be taken into account by policy makers. And they have very practical difficulties in accessing health services because of the lack of information regarding the granted health benefits by the providers. Now, focusing on the social connections, I think it's encouraging that the receiving community generally hold neutral to positive attitudes towards arriving community, which is in contrast to what the media have been presenting in some of the countries as response to the influx of refugees. In all the countries, the arriving community have more positive attitudes towards the receiving than the vice versa. Can I have the next slide? Looking at some of the facilitators, we found that arriving community are likely to downplay their experiences of discrimination and exposure to racism. But culture and language play a major role. This is just a small glimpse that Swedes are described by the arriving community as the distanced. So they are more likely to turn to the peers with migration history for building the bridges. Okay, I need to go to the next one. Now, these are just an illustration of the main gaps between the receiving and arriving community that I wanted to share with you. You can see that on the upper left, these are the main attitudes towards the other group. Blue are the receiving and green are the arriving community. This is Sweden, and Germany and Croatia and Jordan. What we see here that the arriving community have a little bit more positive attitudes towards the other group. But by and large, these differences are not really big. They are significant because of our numbers of the samples, but they are not dramatically different, especially in Sweden and Germany. In Croatia, that has no history of immigration and has no experience, this is different. Now, on the upper right side, there is the perception of realistic threat. This is how the arriving and the receiving community members perceive that their interest, the life interests are at threat. What is encouraging that, again, the differences between the two groups are not dramatic. Always it is the arriving community that perceive that their interests like access to job market and income and so on is more a threat. But that's not, again, that's not very dramatic. Now, on the lower left, there is the perception of how the receiving community think of the arriving as their members in the society. And you can see that in Jordan, the locals perceive the Syrian refugees as the members of the society more than in any of the European countries. And in Croatia, this is the lowest because, again, lack of experience, and Sweden fares better than Germany. And the last thing here is the arriving community own perception of the membership in the society. And you can see that in Sweden, then Germany and Croatia and then Jordan, they think that they are much more part of the society than the locals would actually accept. Thank you, Bernie. We can take down the slideshow.
Yeah, and thank you very much indeed for that fascinating presentation. Lots for everybody to think with, and lots of really interesting points, including the contrast to media discussion, but also all those important points you made at the start around this not being a homogeneous group, around the importance of role and role restoration, around the opportunity of refugees to become active or to resume roles, and particularly the resilience that you've highlighted there. I hope we're going to be able to come back to follow-up questions that I've got, but for now I'm actually going to move on to Alistair, and we can come back in the panel discussion at the end. So Alistair, I wonder if you might tell us a little about your role in local government and how you've approached the challenges of migration and integration in the city of Edinburgh.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning, everyone. As Alison said, my name is Alistair Denny. I'm the Refugee and the Migration Programme Manager at the City of Edinburgh Council. I've been working in this world for about 6 years, ever since the start of the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme in the United Kingdom. I manage a team that works across 3 broad strands of work. First of all, supporting Edinburgh-based resettlement for official UK government schemes. So that's been the Syrian Resettlement Programme, now renamed the UK Resettlement Scheme, and working to support more recent Afghan resettlements. And particularly, we were supporting around 16 families in a temporary hotel-based accommodation situation on the back of the most recent Afghan evacuation. The second strand that we work with is adults who have no recourse to public funds. And the third is families or households with status. So for example, people who have come through the asylum system and then have applied through family reunion to be joined by families. There's no formal system, as I think everybody will know, for such households to be flagged up with local authorities, but where they come to our attention, usually through referrals from other service providers, we will pick up support for them. We've resettled round about 170 households under the official schemes. We support around about 50 adults currently with no recourse to public funds. And I'm sorry, but I don't have an accurate figure for post status families. How I've supported the challenges of resettlement in Edinburgh, flippantly but honestly, frequently in haste and reactively. The dynamics of the work that we do frequently result in that. But I would actually say I have been remarkably fortunate in facing those challenges working within a city context, which had a fairly significant infrastructure already in place, albeit somewhat underdeveloped, and also a fairly multicultural city. So, for example, there was a diaspora, there were language speakers, there were some third sector organizations already working in this field, and there was a really latent capacity which was swiftly able to be built up and brought on stream. So all of those I found extraordinarily helpful when we actually came to the job of building up a resource to support resettlement in the city. The other thing that I was asked to consider was the role of national, local government and various different actors within resettlement. And like others, I went back to Alison Strang and Alistair Age's framework and thought through the relationship to the different categories of foundation, markers, means, and facilitators. And interestingly, initially thought local government didn't have as much an active role to play within the social connections strand as some of the others, but revised my view as I went through it. So looking at the different kind of tiers of government or actors in and around resettlement, it appeared to me that the focus of national government should really be around the foundation. So it's about the rights and citizenship, and therefore it is really for national governments to develop what I've described a clear, rational and consistent policy on rights and citizenship. And along with that, a clear, rational, and one might hope compassionate policy positions on migration and humanitarian protection. And as an officer in local government, that's probably as much as I ought to say about that. Local government focus for me seemed to be firstly around the facilitator strand. So I'm thinking very much around provision of services that develop language and cultural knowledge, and also a strong contributor to safety and stability, whilst also noting that we have a role around some of the markers and means as well. So housing and education, which are obviously local government services. In both cases, though, I think a really important job for both national and local government is then to create space for others to do work that we're maybe not so good at or not so well kitted out to do. So for example, I would say that having set the policy and strategy at national level, national government should then get out the way and let local actors, whether it's local government or because the pattern of provision across the UK I know is different, it may be third sector organisations come in to do the actual work of resettlement. And in turn, I think local government needs to create the space for third sector organisations and other community actors really to get in and do the rich work of community connection. And in particular, so if I can give an example of where I see the two combining but being different, whilst I clearly see local government as having a role around language teaching, we all know that the language you learn in the classroom isn't quite the language you use every day. And it's actually within the context of activity within the community that is not actually language based, but you need the language to be able to enjoy fully, that you develop that richness of understanding. So, okay, I've been to my classroom, this is how you say this, but actually in amongst this group of people who I'm doing some knitting with, we don't quite say it that way, we say it this way. I'm just going to quick look at my notes, but I think I've actually rushed through, and that's pretty much the input that I'd like to give. So I'm just going to stop there.
Alistair, thank you so much. Some absolutely fascinating points that you're making there, and I'm really appreciating the fact that you've focused on infrastructure development in order to enable others, some of them who I think you described as having latent capacity that was activated in times of need and often in haste, but also those groups that can step in, that is really important. And I very much appreciated the points you were making around school and health infrastructure, but I think certainly with debates over here in Glasgow at the moment, libraries are often the things that come up as real sanctuaries for people in communities and places where this work can happen. But I was also noticing a connection there as well to some of the points that Deanne was making when you were speaking of the importance and richness of language and culture, and thinking of the points Deanne was making about the importance of role and role retention, or ability to shift back to role, and those multicultural, multilingual spaces allowing for the performance of different roles from different stages of life, being really important. I wonder, just before I move on to Dylan, because I've still got a couple of more minutes to sit with you, if I might just come back to the almost throwaway comment you made at the start, when you said that often you have to do your work in haste. And we usually think that we need the luxury of planning and time to be able to make things happen. And yet, one of the things we've noticed in Glasgow as the COP city is that we've been able, in haste, to offer, wide hospitality in people's homes, and cook for 90 Indigenous peoples at 2 minutes' notice from the community around Kenmure Street, and that has then also rapidly created those social bonds and connections. And I just wonder whether you have any further reflections on whether haste can sometimes be a facilitator, as opposed to what we often think of it being as a barrier.
In fact, Alison, indeed I do, and probably my most recent experience speaks to that very clearly. I mentioned the work that we did supporting a smallish group of Afghan families in temporary hotel accommodation. We were given 36 hours notice of their arrival.
Yeah.
So from a standing start, we had to create an infrastructure of support in a hotel which was right on the outskirts of the city, as far away from any infrastructure as it is almost possible to be, and yet still be within the city of Edinburgh boundary. Fortunately, given the history of the work that we had been doing, we had a lot of relationships which meant very clear indication that there was no prospect that we would be able to do all of this ourselves, was something that we could move on very, very quickly and pull in a very wide spread of support from different organizations. And I would particularly mention church or faith groups, perhaps better described in this regard. No, not only was that, and the response absolutely had to be, right, get in there, do something. Does it work? Great. Does it not? Do something else.
Yeah.
And just keep going until you had something that was working. So it was very experimental. And the two things that it's done is it's really solidified relationships across the different actors in the city, which is fantastic. And it has also given us a couple of program project ideas, which you will now be able to consider in other contexts.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks so much, Alistair. And that was the sound of my phone just letting me know our time is up. But I'm minded as you're describing that situation, and it's one I recognize myself as well. The kind of 36 hours, you know, do something almost impossible. And yet I think it was the late George McLeod who said nothing builds community like a hard common task, and that was a really good instance of that you've given us. So thanks so much for taking the time to share those thoughts with us, Alistair. I'm now going to move on to Dylan and come to you, Dylan, with a separate question, which is about your role and the work of Refugees for Justice and how this relates to refugee integration. And then also some thoughts on opportunities for refugee voices to be heard in national policy making and research, and what needs to happen for that to be meaningful. So Dylan, over to you.
Great, thank you, Alison. I will try my best to answer your questions, but I'd like to do that in the framework of three things. I'm going to start with a statement that I think that the UK immigration and asylum policy is designed to create a disconnected society. And I'll explain how. In doing that, I may, because I noticed that we have colleagues from other countries, I'll cover some of the basics, so apologies if some of that is stating the obvious for most of you. And then I'll cover what happened during COVID that exposed the reality of this statement. And then I'll try to cover a little bit about what's coming next with the Nationality Immigration Bill, and so what we need to be mindful of. The UK asylum and immigration policy is designed to create a disconnected society. And most of you on this call know that asylum seekers, people who come to the UK in pursuit of sanctuary and submit their asylum claim, are deliberately and by law, by policy, deliberately put into isolation. And that isolation includes financial isolation. It includes social isolation as well. So people who seek asylum in the UK are not entitled to all the means of protection that are provided to other citizens or residents of the UK on the same level. Asylum seekers are given £37 a week to cover their needs, including food and clothes and other life necessities. That's definitely not enough financial support. So they're deliberately put in extreme poverty. They're not entitled to access other services that are provided by local governments, including mainstream housing and homelessness services. So they're not in the mainstream housing and homelessness services. They're not entitled to the same measures of social security and benefits that are provided to other residents, other citizens in the UK. And they're denied many other rights and entitlements, including right to full-time higher education, right, like I said, right to, they're not allowed to work, they're not allowed to access benefits. And these are domains of integration, as we know, most of us know. These are key factors in integration. You cannot expect social integration and social connection happen if you put people in the most extreme margins of society and you do that deliberately in your policy. That's the situation that we have in the UK. Asylum seekers are deliberately put in extreme poverty, in homelessness while not being entitled to homelessness services. They're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to access the job market. In other words, all the means of integration and all the means of anyone feeling any sense of agency and power and belonging is taken away from people. And this makes the work of wonderful organizations like Scottish Refugee Council and Freedom from Torture that we heard from them on the panel this morning very difficult. This is what we have in normal circumstances. During COVID, things got deteriorated. During COVID, things happened in Glasgow and across the UK that really exposed this level of inequality and discrimination and really exposed the consequences of that on our cities and on our society as a whole. I'm going to focus on asylum support and accommodation provision as an example, as one of the as the main case study that was highlighted during COVID. So as I said, asylum seekers are taken out of the mainstream support provision. So they don't have social workers or DWP caseworkers, or they're not connected to those mainstream measures and mechanisms for social protection and integration. They're taken away out of that system, and their safeguarding and duty of care is contracted to a private company. In Scotland, that's the Mears Group, and there are other private companies like Serco and Clear Spring in other areas of the UK. So through a multi-billion contract, this support provision has been contracted to private companies, to asylum seekers. And this is the system. So essentially, you take people out of mainstream protection mechanisms, you put them at the mercy of private companies. During COVID, at the beginning of the first lockdown in April and May 2020, when we were all panicking and we didn't know what's coming next, when the cities were turning into ghost towns and people were really scared and anxious about the virus, we were all told to stay home and stay safe and keep connected to each other online and protect ourselves and others around us from contracting and spreading the virus. There were 320 people, around 350 people in Glasgow who were evicted from their flats right at the beginning of the lockdown. A housing officer of the private company knock on their doors and say, you've got 20 minutes to get into the taxi and go to an unknown destination. People didn't speak English, they don't know where they're going, they don't know why they're being moved to, they didn't know what their rights are, if they could refuse to leave their flats, because in their 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom independent flats, they would have been safe from COVID. All of this were taken away from them. People were evicted from their houses and they were transferred to institutional accommodations, to hotels and other forms of shared accommodations with 80, 90 other asylum seekers running about in the corridors. This was exactly the opposite of what was provided to other people in Scotland, or what was told other people to do to protect themselves. We're told to stay in our flats, to stay in our houses, and those of us who were lucky had access to some additional measures of support, including financial support and other supports from local governments, in order to be able to protect ourselves in line with public health guidelines. The exact opposite of this happened to asylum seekers in Glasgow. They were evicted from their independent 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom flats. They were put in the hotels. Those flats were available. They could have been allowed to stay in those accommodations, but they were not. They were taken away from their flats, put in the hotels. Their financial support, £37 a week, was cut when they were in the hotels. None of them were registered with a GP within the lockdown, within a global pandemic. People did not have access to nutritious food. And people stayed in these conditions for months. Some people stayed for 11 months. The consequences of this were very severe on everyone. Myself and a few of my friends at the very early days of the move of people from their flats to their hotels were out there supporting people, collecting donations, distributing, etc. And we were really witnessing that people are being damaged psychologically and physically. It's hard to imagine how difficult it is in the middle of the pandemic to be locked in a room in a hotel, to be evicted from your house, be locked in a room in a hotel, your financial support is cut, you've got £0 in your pocket. If you need to buy a pair of socks or some apples from the market, no chance. You don't have access to a GP. There's no one that you can go to ask for support. The only person is the hotel reception, who's not qualified, who's not trained, who's not a social worker, who's not a psychotherapist. People were really being damaged and we were witnessing it. People were knackered, were tired, were suicidal, were telling us that we feel that we are in detention again. I'm a survivor of torture. I have many multiple physical and mental health difficulties, and I'm trapped in this situation. I don't know what to do. We tried to raise it with authorities, and we were told that everything is, quote unquote, appropriate and to the standard. And then the consequences became very visible. unfortunately, one of our friends killed himself in one of those hotels as a direct result of being trapped in those conditions. And then the parking incident happened on the 26th of June. One of those asylum seekers in one of those hotels who exhausted all the means of asking for support, but completely neglected, committed a knife crime. He stabbed other asylum seekers in the hotels and staff members. And unfortunately, he got shot dead by police. This was a national tragedy for all of us. And what made it most painful was the fact that we knew that this was, we expected tragedies like this to happen. We were very, very sad, but we were 10 times more sad because we saw the process of building up this pressure and leading to these kind of tragedies. This exposed the dysfunctionality of the system. There is a system in play that involves the UK government, Home Office, contracting a private company to take care of asylum seekers and to be their DWP, to be their social worker, to be their caseworker. The duty of care is contracted to a private company that fails to provide that service and fails to cooperate with local authorities and civil society organizations. Now, our job in Refugees for Justice, with support from other organizations in the ROOF coalition, it's an amazing coalition of third sector organizations in Glasgow, is to make sure that this is investigated and make sure that lessons are learned from what happened during COVID, to make sure that what are the gaps and dysfunctionalities of asylum support and accommodation provision, what needs to change in the future to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Now, what's coming up next is interesting. The UK government, through the new bill, the Nationality and Borders Bill, is planning to introduce a widespread use of institutional accommodations and further eliminate people's access to rights and entitlements. The COVID-19 pandemic was a trial of using institutional accommodations and limited rights and entitlements for people in those situations. And it didn't happen only in Glasgow, it happened across the UK. The new bill is effectively and very openly planning to introduce asylum camps. They call asylum reception centers. Those are likely to be in remote areas outside of cities or even within the cities. But warehousing asylum seekers is a model that they tried during COVID, and they're planning to implement it more widely through the bill. They're also planning the new bill, the legislation, is also planning to further reduce people who come here through and claim asylum in the UK, even if they are granted refugee status, they will still stay in a legal limbo for a prolonged period of time with very limited access to social security and benefit and family reunion rights. So further decreasing people's rights and further expanding the harmful practice of establishing asylum camps in the UK. Even they're talking about, the bill clearly talks about establishing offshore centers outside of the UK. So what's coming up next is a highly disruptive and destabilizing piece of legislation. It's going to create a high level of confusion and chaos within public service provision, within voluntary sector service provision. It's not only inhumane on individuals who are subject to the system, but it's also harmful for our cities and our society and our community. And I really want to invite you as academics and as third sector organizations to be mindful of what's coming next, to be mindful of what happened during COVID, to make sure that we have processes to learn the lessons and oblige the power holders and policymakers to learn the lessons and make sure that we do not allow policies to be imposed on our society that are clear to inflict harm on everyone in the society, including people who are subject to the system.
Ilan, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to take us through those three really important points about the changes in legislation that are coming, about the way in which the UK government policies are creating a disconnected society of isolation, economic and social levels, the way that the inequalities were exposed so clearly, and the inhumane conditions were instituted, and the real danger that we have with the new bill that is going through its third reading at the moment, that we will see the creation of camps in remote areas that further isolate people. And I think this connects very well to Elodie's point in the last panel about the isolation and about how we enable integration into communities when people are separated out from communities. I'm just checking with Bryony, but I think that we're up to time now at 12:25. She's nodding her head. So without further ado, I'd just like to thank all three panelists who clearly each needed a couple of hours to really do full justice to the depth and seriousness of the topics that they're raising. I would love to hear and think more with these questions of role and the many roles and the restoration of role that Deanne was raising. Really want to engage more with Alistair about these questions of hasty but positive practical action, and always enjoy hearing his thoughtful compassion in those in the way that he thinks through what is possible and what is not within local authority gift. And then Dylan, my friend, as always, it is just fantastic to have your voice, keeping us right and keeping us to the rights that are for all, and reminding us that what is inhumane treatment of refugees and asylum seekers within our system is a matter of inhumane treatment for the whole of society, and readying us to be able to work alongside Alistair and others in that practical care and needs that will be ongoing and is the next challenge to come to our communities. So thank you all, Dylan, Deanne and Alistair, for your time on this panel. Thanks very much, and back to Bryony.
Thanks so much, Alison. Yeah, especially thanks to you, considering you've not been very well and you didn't have a voice at 6 o'clock this morning. You've done incredibly well given those circumstances. And yeah, absolutely, I can't echo enough what you've just said there, Alison. Thank you so much, Deanne, and Alistair. It's been really great to hear all your inputs there. So the next part of today's conference, and apologies for the noise outside, I live on Leith Walk where there's lots of construction workers going on outside, so apologies for that. But we're going to move through to the exciting part where we open up the discussion to all of you at our roundtable discussion. This will be moderated by our very own Emelina, who is one of the researchers on our team as well. So I'm going to hand over to her, and yeah, just keep using the chat function, or feel free to pop your hand up or unmute yourself. Emelina.
Great, thank you, Bryony, and thank you, Alison, and both of our fantastic panels. Definitely been a really thought-provoking day. What I'd like to do next is sort of open up our digital floor for some discussion, reflections, questions. You've had really interesting reflections in the chat and some questions. So I'm going to start with some of those. But in the meantime, I would encourage you to either write your questions on the chat or use the reactions button, and then I will give the floor to you. You can either ask broader questions for all of our panelists, or if there's any particular projects and services you'd like to hear more about, then feel free to ask questions about that. I would also like to encourage our panelists, if you want to share any further reflections or questions, as well as our lovely moderators, if you'd like to share some further thoughts. So very much an open discussion, but I would first like to invite one of our colleagues, Leila, to ask a question following Fiona's presentation.
Thanks, Emelina, and thank you so much to all the speakers. Some of it really hard to hear, but absolutely essential to hear as well. Just going back to Fiona's presentation, and it's something we've spoken about together, but that she observed the unspoken familiarity with people in a neighbourhood, giving that example of one of her clients, really contributed to him feeling safe, even though it was a kind of unsafe area. And I just wanted to ask the rest of the people in the room, in the virtual room, whether that resonates with other people and their organisations and experiences.
Would our practice panelists like to share some reflections on this first?
I would be happy to, Leila, but I had a breakdown in connection and I didn't hear the full question. Sorry about that.
It was just it was around feeling safe by being familiar with people in the local area and whether others that resonated with others. Fiona had talked about the client of hers who felt very safe in what was not a nice area, or he'd had his door kicked in there anyway, but wanted to go back because he felt familiar in that situation. I can see Alistair's got his hand up.
Alistair, is it a question that you want to come, or is it this particular topic that you wanted to add to?
It was this particular topic, just to comment on it. And I think, Leila, you also, in a sense, references, I think, your first lesson of the sort of quite humble, simple interactions of daily life and routine and welcome that can be so significant. And it just, many of you will have heard me from the very initial work that Alison and I did in Islington and Pollock Shores, just evidence of, I had expected, the powerful predictors to be very strong, social engagement and reciprocity. And yet one of the strongest features that came out of that early work was these very small acts of welcome and recognition. And I think we've touched on a lot more big, important issues, and we should really do that in the discussion that follows. But it's not just to miss this real power of civility and familiarity, of how powerful that can be. So it's such a modest thing to seek and to attain, and yet it seems to be so powerful. So I don't wish to major on that, but just to not let it go by, that by those everyday acts of kindness and recognition and welcome, even if it's just a smile and an eyebrow raise rather than a spoken welcome, that can be really quite powerful in terms of the identification of reciprocity in a small sense, in terms of shared use of space.
Thank you. Elodie?
Yeah, it was just to go back on the point of familiarity as well. Fiona is absolutely correct. The case that you mentioned, Fiona, is really representative of people experiencing countless moves during the asylum process, not because they wish to move, but because for logistic reasons, the asylum accommodation provider will move people often with very little warning, as Dylan mentioned in his presentation. Once people have status in Scotland, most people, 98% of people, will experience homelessness and will need to navigate the homeless system. And through that, they're going to be asked about areas where they want to live. And in our communications with Glasgow State Council Homeless Service, it's been an ongoing discussion because obviously people don't know many areas. They will know a couple of streets or a few streets that they are comfortable in. That's obviously too narrow from a homelessness services point of view. They need a postcode area almost. And we also realised that refugees are really, some people we work with are really attached to areas that are surprisingly not the high demanded areas of Glasgow. Some, there will be people who will want to live in the West End, which is the very demanded areas by everyone. But when dispersal changed a few years ago from basically when the asylum accommodation provider changed from Glasgow State Council to private company, and then this private company sourced flats through private landlords, asylum seekers started being accommodated in what we call the Shettleston corridor. And this area became a highly demanded area by people once they got status, which was very, very surprising. And at Scottish Refugee Council, since we have been working in much more with social landlords in the east of the city who noticed that they were getting more and more applications from refugee people who've experienced the refugee journey. So I think it's I think that the case that you've mentioned, Fiona, is really interesting because it's I think it goes back to really understand what people experience and trying to understand what people really need and want, because it's not often what we may make assumptions about, and that's very important as well.
Thank you, Elodie. That was really great, useful reflections for us. Could I invite Raoul to share, followed by Alison Strang?
Thank you. I've just learned how to lower the hand now, so you learn something every day. I just wanted to build on top of what the other people are saying, because it does resonate a lot with what we experience with FRIS in Cardiff. So the situation in Cardiff is that a lot of the sponsors and tend to get accommodation in Splot and Adamsdown, pending their asylum claim, because those areas are the most affordable. And it is where a lot of our families end up achieving more, well, not permanent housing, but when the family arrives, that is often where the accommodation is provided for them. And so these are areas where there is a much disproportionately large community of people from the asylum and refugee backgrounds. And what it means is that they build up. It's very important. The idea of routine is very important. The idea of knowing where the shops are, knowing how to take your kids to school. And the first year, however, does tend to be a bit disruptive, because what happens is where they are first housed when quarantining, because we now have quarantine when they arrive, is then for a couple of weeks, and then they're moved to somewhere else for a month or 2 or 3 months, and then they're moved to somewhere else. And in each time, their postcode will change, their GP will change, their shops will change. It can be a very stressful time. Maybe the sponsor will be more resilient because they've been living in, for example, Cardiff for a bit longer. They've gotten to know the area better, but particularly for the arriving spouse, it just adds on to those difficulties of having to get used to a completely new place over and over again. And so what we do find is that trying to work with them to help them reestablish that routine, to help them to, if they are moving, discuss what are the new buses for them to get their kids to school? Where is the nearest GP that they can now register with? And using our peer buddies to give them some advice on the local area they're now moving to, any things to look out for. Things like bin timetables, for example, comes up a lot, that in Cardiff, the bin timetables in one area might be completely different. All these little things that add up to be really important in making you feel connected to the area. It's a key part of our work to not just get the things like universal credit, all those government things down to pat, but trying to help them get outside and experience the local area they're moving to a bit more, so they can start to build that sense of rootedness earlier on.
Thank you. That again really highlights what we've talked a lot about today in terms of the importance of that peer support. Alison, would you like to come in on next?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for what's been a really enriching morning. And so many things, just sort of picking up on Raoul, what you were talking about there, and it's been really helpful to learn from those of you who are doing frontline work how important stability is, as Elodie emphasized too, and that was something that came across, in our early work and consistently throughout, and yet it seems to be so difficult to achieve that stability for certainly asylum seekers, but new refugees as well. But the thing that I wanted to ask our community online was around where we were just talking there about those everyday encounters in the neighborhood, and there is a new area of work looking at conviviality, just the kind of friendliness and the sense of being known by other people who operate in the same location as you. And so we're increasingly appreciating how important that is. But to me, that takes us right through to the biggest of all policy questions around what are the attitudes of other people, other settled people, the receiving community, as Diane describes it, towards newcomers. And that's where Diane's work, I think, is so important for us to explore. So my question really is, what can we do as academics, as practitioners, as policymakers to really promote the building of positive attitudes to newcomers by receiving communities? And I know it's a huge question, but I'd love to hear thoughts from people about what we can actually do in this, what we experience as very hostile environment.
What a fantastic question. Would I be first able to invite Diane to reflect that a little, and then perhaps if any of our other panelists would like to raise a hand to share their reflections?
Well, first of all, it is a huge question, but it's also a great question. I mean, it's a question of all. What first came to my mind is actually thinking whether the decision makers, the governments, they really want to help the integration of the newcomers, or they want to make it difficult for them because of security reasons, because of the resources, or whatever. From what I understand, the practice in Sweden, for example, is to welcome these people and make them and help them rebuild their life and become what one of the participants in our study said, useful members of the new community, where they can contribute through being able to access the labor market, work, support their families, get off the benefits, and start paying taxes. And the ways, of course, to do that is also well known. And today, the role of the employers has been very much mentioned. And there are models where the employers actually provide the guidance in terms of getting into the jobs, the skills, and so forth, but also language acquisition on the job among the new peers, the peers that people start working with. So the benefit, of course, is also that this builds the bridges and connection in terms of connections. The consequences for self-sustaining themselves and the families has implications for the mental health, for feeling welcome, not isolated, and so forth and so forth. But I think that is the decision of the governments. How do they want to treat the arriving community members? Whether they want to deter the new ones by the harsh and unpleasant and sometimes, the measures. So I think that's where the key question is, and that's why I said it's a huge but also great question.
Thank you so much for that. It really highlights that while individuals and communities play part, governments definitely have responsibility in this as well. Dylan, would you like to come in on next, followed by Alison?
Yes, just quickly on Alison's question about public attitude. I think political narrative definitely permeates into public narrative and public attitude. So the more welcoming and progressive our political discussions and narrative are, I think the more welcoming society we will have. But I think one thing that I would say policymakers should do is to really start with the fundamentals of rights and entitlements of people. I think policymakers should be concerned with people's fundamental rights and entitlements, basic human rights to adequate housing, to freedom and liberty, to financial support, to employment. These are the areas that policy and legislation should be concerned with and think about increasing people's access to those fundamental rights, because those will have a direct connection, have a direct impact on people's ability to integrate, but also on public attitude. The receiving community would be more, it would make it easier for the receiving community to welcome asylum seekers if they are perceived and act and allowed to act as normal citizens. It would make it more difficult for the receiving community to welcome people if they are perceived as a bunch of unemployed, miserable asylum seekers in extreme poverty. These are vulnerabilities imposed on people. These are not, asylum seekers are not inherently extremely poor, unemployed, miserable people in Scotland. These are restrictions and vulnerabilities imposed on people by our policies. So those fundamental rights are important, and granting those fundamental rights will help receiving community to be more welcoming towards people. If you don't mind, Emmeline, I'm going to take a couple of minutes. There's a question from Zoe in the chat that I want to answer.
Okay, when you go.
Spot on. The new the new Nationality and Borders Bill is essentially effectively introducing what we had in called direct provision system in Ireland, and it was very clearly demonstrated it was extremely harmful, and it's now shifting. So, but we are taking towards.
Can I just ask that others would mute themselves? I think it might be Amelia's. Thank you. On you go, Dylan.
Towards the opposite direction. The direct provision in Ireland is being reversed because it's proven to be harmful. But in the UK, we are effectively introducing the direct provision. In terms of Scotland, the second part of Zoe's question, the integration from day one, just to be clear, that's not a policy in Scotland. Scotland doesn't have a policy, doesn't have a legislation on asylum and immigration, because that's not devolved. Integration from day one is a principle that informs Scotland's approach to refugee integration. So we believe in Scotland that integration starts from day one, but we don't have enough to implement it on the ground. There are things that Scottish government can do in terms of policy and legislation to enable integration from day one. And those are not easy things. Those require negotiation. Those require Scottish government to get into a fight, get into an argument, get into negotiation with the UK government. My idea of how to do this is Scotland should have its own alternative asylum support and accommodation provision. Integration from day one means when asylum seekers come here, they will be able to access mainstream housing and homelessness services like everyone else, provided by local authorities, centrally funded, locally managed. Simple. We can't do that now because those rights are taken away from people by policies that are set in Westminster. Scottish government could, and I said this is not easy, but it requires a political will to enter negotiation and create this system. Integration from day one means asylum seekers to be allowed to work in Scotland. Again, these rights are taken away by reserved policies. So it requires negotiation, it requires a battle, and it requires political will. Integration from day one means asylum seekers have access to the same level of financial support that every other resident in Scotland have access to through DWP, and so on. Access to rights and entitlement on an equal basis to all the other residents in Scotland. Those are the fundamental building blocks of integration and creating social connections. So, and that's how we can make integration from day one happen. Again, it requires political will. It's a complicated legal and legislative maze that needs to be navigated, but I think we need to start from somewhere.
Great, thank you so much, Dylan. That was very insightful. I'm conscious of time, so I'd invite Alison to share her reflections next, and then I believe we might have to move towards the kind of final remarks of kind of summarising our day today. Alison,
Yeah, thanks so much. It's just a really rich discussion, but I did want to come back on Alison's question because it is such a good question. And it's one of the ones that people ask the most often, what can we do particularly to counter these such xenophobic tropes that we find being perpetuated. And I think there's two things that I found helpful. One of them is not so much the research on integration, which is the hard daily task, but actually looking at some of the things that have been found to work in conflict transformation situations, and particularly work done by Genocide Watch on what needs to happen at all the different stages, and what we can do within civil society, but also what is the work of our legislators to do or of multinational companies to do. So elements around arms embargoes are really important to prevent violence. So what is it as a citizen you can do, and what is it that you can ask your representatives to do? And I think coming with an analysis, thinking through spectrums of allies, doing the work of working out what's mine to do, what's my power to do, who do I know, what power do they have to do this, and constantly working through that is important. But I also just wanted to share a lovely piece of research about changing behaviour from bad to good, which was about fossils being stolen from a beach in Lyme Regis. And the local authority had a sign up that said 20% of people who come to this beach steal fossils. And then they monitored what happened, and 25%, 30% of people going to the beach started to steal the fossils because people felt encouraged by the fact that people were stealing fossils. So the local authority changed the sign and they said 80% of people who come to this beach do not steal fossils. And it went down to about 5% of people, they think, stealing fossils. So it's a tiny cautionary tale, and what applies to fossils is not the same as what applies to the fraught, difficult experiences that we're talking about here. But I do think that there is something about just performativity. Do good and a lot follows. Cleave to what's good and a lot will follow. I think when we only focus on the dead cats of government, we get more dead cats. Whereas when we actually say, do you know, fine, you do that, but we're going to concentrate on what is actually amazing, the resilience that Deanne spoke about at the very start, then we constantly see amazing things happening, as Deanne and Alistair, but also Dylan have shown, and the legal processes of justice making can also be allowed to do their work with the support of what is good.
Thank you, Alison. What a fantastic way to wrap up our Q&A with some reflections on hope and ways forward. I'm conscious of time. I'd hope we could have continued these conversations further, but time is against us. So I will pass the floor again to my colleague Bryony to lead us to the final remarks of the day.
Thank you so much, Emelina. Thank you everybody for your fantastic questions and reflections. And I can see more and more popping up in the chat, and it would have just been great if we could have captured even more time for that. Before I hand over to Alison for some final remarks, we actually have another very short speaker that we want to introduce, just to say a few words, and that's Wafa Shaheen. Are you here just now?
I am.
You are. I'll hand over to you, Wafa.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Coming.
Thank you. I missed most of the conversation, which is a shame, but I know it's recorded so I can listen to it again, which would be great. I am just joining to share my goodbyes, but not really goodbyes, to Alison. My thanks, my sincere thanks on behalf of everybody in Scotland and beyond for all the work that Alison did. I tell people every day, Alison Strang, the first time I heard her name was back in 2005. Yes, I am that old. And I couldn't believe my eyes when I actually met her in 2013 and started working with her. The work that you did, Alison, will live for long time to come, and had great impact on Scotland, on beyond Scotland as well. And that will, I'm hoping that, not me because I'm old, I'm hoping Dylan and all the younger generation will continue defending the principles that you created, the framework that you created for integration. I need to remind you, integration matters. Is actually in all Scottish local authorities contracts with the Home Office. This is the basis that they use for the integration work, that they gauge the success of local authorities in doing so. So just to say thank you on behalf of everybody, and it will be great actually. So you are retiring, which means that we will have more of your time to do other stuff. Not necessarily work, but yeah, nice things. So yeah, thank you so much, Alison.
Well, thank you, Wafa. You've thrown me now, all of you. That's very naughty because Wafa's appearance was not on my programme, but it's lovely. Thank you so much for your kind words, Wafa. And it's just been a great morning to be with so many of you who are really important colleagues to me and have been for a long time. And I would just say, in terms of, you know, the work that we've all been doing over the last 20 years, that it absolutely has been a collaborative effort. So I'm delighted that my colleague Alistair has been with us this morning, because actually, you know, that Alistair and I did that work together. It wouldn't have happened if it weren't for Alistair. And then, of course, colleagues at Scottish Refugee Council and the British Red Cross and many other organisations, Freedom from Torture and so on and so on and so on. I think we've really worked this thing out together, and so it's been a real privilege to be able to work with everyone. As Wafa says, I'm not disappearing. I'm kind of nervously saying, you know, I'll keep the doors open, but as they say in retirement, the joy of it is that you can pick and choose what you do. So get in touch, because I'm sure I shall want to keep in touch with you. So thank you. That's very kind. And now, of course, I've only got a few minutes to say my final words, which are really around what a great morning. Thank you so much to all our extremely experienced practice and policy colleagues. I think for me, you know, a key message that's come out of what we've been saying is that one of resilience. It's come through time and time again that refugees are resilient. They've been through so much, and that would certainly be my overriding message from my whole career, really, with work in the humanitarian sector too. That as Dylan was just saying at the end there, you know, the importance of rights as a foundation for people's lives cannot be overstated. So important for integration from everybody's perspective. The importance of the work of practice to enable people to access those rights, but actually, as people have been saying, to build social networks through peers. Some really interesting examples of peer work. So thank you for that. And just that challenge of helping newcomers to gradually build their connections, taking you back to that model that has come out of our work with FRIS, the Family Reunion Service, the socio-ecological model of how there is a trajectory of building close relationships and then gradually kind of expanding your social world within the new society. I think that's come through the practice and policy discussions too. And then the final one, which I can't leave without mentioning, is the link between integration and mental health. You know, and Dylan again was movingly talking about the awful events when asylum seekers were transferred to hotels in Glasgow, but all of our work really, and yes, Fiona was similarly talking about the impact of being in the asylum system for protracted periods of time. So for me, I feel that's a message we need to get out there to policymakers, that you can't treat people as if they were objects and just hold them in a holding place until you process them and then expect them to come out of that holding place fit and well and able to contribute to our society are actually damaging people by the way we treat them, and then there will be negative consequences, obviously for those people themselves, but actually for our society too. So for me, that is just such an important lesson, that if we are inhumane, we undermine people's humanity. And as Deanne was saying, you know, being able to be yourself, to fulfill the roles that define you is so crucial. And yeah, we have to really bring that into the way we support newcomers to our society. So lots of things to take forward. I hope that we'll take the conversations forward. I just want to really thank everybody for joining us this morning, for sticking with us throughout, and I'm sure there's lots of conversations to be had. So I think you know how to get in touch with us, find the reports of various recent pieces of work that have been done at IGHD are on the QMU website, and you can also find ways of getting in touch with the research team at QMU through that. So finally, a big thank you to the team at QMU and all those who have helped to organise the conference this morning. I could name you. I was going to say I can't name. I could name you all. So many thanks to Bryony for hosting us. To Helen, to Layla, to Eric, to Emelina, to Nicole, and to Alistair for his support of this work. And thank you all very much.